everyone. I'm Bernadette Melnick, Ohio State's Chief Wellness Officer and Dean of the College of Nursing. I'm super excited today to introduce the module on leading and understanding yourself. As a leader, we have to recognize our strengths as well as our limitations. We have two awesome experts who are nationally renowned to talk to you about these strategies today, and they include Dr. Lynn Gallagher Ford, Director of our Center for Transdisciplinary Evidence-Based Practice, and Dr. Jerry Mansfield, Chief Nursing Officer for University Hospital and Ross Hart Hospital at Ohio State. They are going to share with you nuggets of wisdom that they have successfully mastered over the course of their own leadership journey. I'm sure you will take a lot of pearls from the advice that they have to offer.
Welcome. This module focuses on your self-assessment. I'm sure most of you have probably taken self-assessments, probably many of them over your careers, and you were to have taken one prior to this one, so hopefully you have done that. That one was the Leadership Practices Inventory, a 30-item questionnaire, 10-point Likert scale that is based on the research done by Kouzes and Posner in the Leadership Challenge. So that's but one of many leadership assessments out there. I'm sure you could rattle off many others, but that's the one that you were asked to focus on for this particular module. Self-assessments, leading yourself, that's at the heart of being a confident and competent leader, is understanding yourself. The Center for Creative Leadership, headquartered out of Greensboro, North Carolina, has said the number one difference maker, delineator between successful leaders and those that derail, as they call it, is self-awareness. So until you know yourself, how can you lead others, and certainly how can you lead a team and an organization? You really can't. So you have to know what are your strengths, what are your competencies, and where are those areas that you are not as competent in. So that's the focus of today, is leading yourself. And with me are Lynn and Jerry, and we're going to be focusing on not just this leadership assessment that you've taken, but self-awareness and self-assessments in general, and their focus and their knowledge and their insights based on long careers in the healthcare field. So why don't we start by asking you both, what kinds of things did you learn from this particular assessment first, and then self-assessments in general? What has been your experience with those? So Lynn, you want to start? Or?
Sure. So I had never taken this self-assessment before, although I've taken many over the years, as you have mentioned. And so when I learned some things that I kind of already knew about myself, so it sort of reinforced some of the things I know about myself. But what I like about it was very quick, and I like things when they're quick, because I like to move quickly. Yep. But what I sort of found that I've known about myself is that I'm not a detail person. I'm sort of a idea person, and my mind is always on to the next thing, and I have another good idea and another good idea, but I like to keep moving on. I don't really take a lot of time for detail, and so I think the things that I saw what I wasn't so strong in were the things that are about making sure that everything's done on this project before you move to the next. What I have found historically in my career through other tools that I'll just mention as another example, through always looking at yourself. I think it's a good idea to constantly be reflecting and seeking out ways to get feedback, either through some tools or through talking to other people, or people above, people alongside, people that report up. There's that you have a constant flow of information about how you're doing. Because as you change and you develop and you progress in your style, there's new things emerging and other things diminishing. And so I think it's a good idea to constantly be looking. But I remember years ago, I was quite an athlete as a kid, and so I always bring my sports thinking into my world. And I always thought that I was really a very team-oriented leader. Always make sure I get everybody's opinion, not very dictatorial, because I never liked being led that way. And at one point years ago, we were all asked to do a 360 evaluation, and so I rated myself very high on the team orientation, and the feedback from all around me was, yes, you're team oriented. We always feel invited to the table to put our opinions out on the table, and you create that place. But they said, but you don't really listen to what we offer. You've already got your mind made up. So although I bring the team together and I ask for information, I wasn't really good at taking the time to hear it, think about it, and find ways to include pieces from everybody. So that was great feedback to me, because I thought I had that one nailed, just by having them at the table. But there's more to it than just having them at the table. You have to also listen to what they say and bring those, thoughts together and have it really feel like a team, because that is the essence of a team. So, it's just another example of different kinds of tools and different points in your career where you learn new things.
And before we go to Jerry, if I could ask you just to highlight one of your strengths, one of your, what you would call your strongest competencies.
Well, I think most of my strongest competencies, and I actually had one of the people that I currently work with, had her fill one of these out for me too, just to kind of check that we were on the same page. And I think the area that I am the strongest overall, as I look at it thematically, is in acknowledging other folks. Like making people feel like they're. It's not really the enabling others. It's
more encouraging.
Let me go back. That's not really what it was. It was the one I scored the highest on was challenging the process, which is not a surprise at all. Because if you asked my mother, she would say I've been doing that
since you could challenge the process.
Since I could challenge the process. So that's sort of a natural style for me, I think. That I'm always wondering, why are we doing it that way, and isn't there a different way, and couldn't we explore something else? But I challenge it in a way that. It seems that there's other things that I'm doing too that are including others, and to me that's a great thing, because way back in my career I wasn't so good at that. So I think I've grown better at inclusion.
Yeah, and if I could just quickly jump off and then we'll go over to Jerry and his thoughts on this. Is you mentioned the 360 assessment, and probably everyone out there has done these, but just in case you're that rare person who hasn't had one of those done, it really can be very, very powerful, especially if you believe the results and you actually want the results and you use it to help you, not to use it against people who filled it out. But to get ideas from those above you, beside you, who work for you, perhaps outside of your immediate circle of influence, to give you feedback. And it really should fit two criteria. One, it should be people who know you well enough to fill this out accurately. And secondly, there should be that trust factor so that they will give you honest feedback. And so it's even more important that you use it to help yourself, not to abuse others with it. So please.
Yeah.
Okay, Jerry, your thoughts on your assessment and assessments in general?
Before I get to my assessment, I want to highlight, because it leads into what I will say, when Lynn talked about she thought she was very team-oriented, but her team told her otherwise. There are subtle differences in how we come across to others that are important for us to know. You might call those blind spots. And if you're not aware of them, those are the kinds of things that, if not taken in check, changed or modified in such a way that involves others, could be a reason that the career path that you're on, you're not able to move along further than you thought you could. And so when people are giving you feedback and self-assessment tools like this, or the 360 you mentioned, you ought to be very open to what you're being told. Now, if you're like me and you're a perfectionist, you go to the negative comments right away, because what do I need to fix?
Yeah, right.
And you may stay too long on that and miss the opportunity to really leverage a strength that you might have that the organization may need at the time. So for me, when I filled out the self-assessment, there was a surprise. The first was my lowest scoring opportunities were under challenging the process. And what was interesting is the overall category, most of my scores were very high, but there were two that were not. Looks outside the organization for ways to improve, and experiments and takes risks. And I think that based on my current position and what I'm doing, that is a reflection of what we're dealing with right now in our organization with health reform. We're trying to figure out, where's this organization going and how will we thrive into the future. And I used to be a champion of looking outside the organization for ideas, but I think I've been there a while. I've gotten so used to hearing the reasons why we can't do things that I may have lost that opportunity. So this would served as a good reminder that I need to sort of step outside our organization or even outside our industry for maybe some creative solutions. Now, my highest scoring one was enabling others to act. And that one struck me because actually a year ago, I took a new position with the organization, actually 2 years ago. But a year ago, we started a process with 360s for my entire team. And one of the things that the staff was saying that report to me was, we'd like to be more involved in taking projects forward. And they felt that I was trying to hang on to things too much. So it's something we've all been working on. So I've delegated projects, I've turned it over to them, they keep me updated, and frankly, those projects are doing very well. So I think it was just edification that the work that we have been doing over the last year to sort of transition ownership and accountability for some things that are important to the organization might be having an effect.
Okay. So obviously you've had long careers to this point. You've used these assessments that you've said, and you've probably seen others use them as well. Can you think of an example or two about how this has really been beneficial, whether it was for yourself or someone who works for you?
Well, I think the thing that I've learned, just sort of generically, and then I'll talk about a specific example, one of the key things that I remember, I do a lot of reading also. People give me books and I actually read them cover to cover and highlight them and stuff. So one of those little books that I have found has resonated so much for me in my career is The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. It's like this big, and it's sort of based on like a Maslow's hierarchy, and the base level is trust. And they do a great job of explaining in this story, this metaphor, the story they tell about how, they kind of present this group, and the person that you think is the problem, turns out that's not the problem, and how they discover, sort of where the real, squeaky wheel is. But anyway, so that little book has really impressed me, and it has, it always is in my mind when I'm looking at my own situation, or even better when I'm looking at other people's situations, because it's much easier to see what's going wrong in that problem versus your own a lot of the time. But I had become a member of a new team a couple years ago in a kind of a new environment for me. And so I entered a new team. And I had used that book in a previous organization. And when I came to this new small team, and I'd been used to being on big teams, I came to this new small team, all I could think about was this group really needs to read that book, because I could almost identify the exact people from the book in the group. And so I offered that suggestion. I just said, this is a book that's been really great for me, and I think we could read it. And then we structured follow-up meetings to talk about that book. And it was just an incredibly powerful experience, particularly in a small group, because it was kind of hard to escape, who was who and what the dynamics were. So that's an example of, having been assigned a book in a previous world, a very large organization where we were trying to work through some stuff, and taking that forward into a completely different environment where it was even more impactful, and it completely changed the communication on that team and what we were thinking the problem was. And how, unless you fix that base problem, just like in Maslow, unless you feel safe and secure, you can't move to self-actualization. And so I think that trying to, bring experience and those nuggets from other places into completely new places render real surprises in terms of, you have no idea what great things can come from. The way I experienced that book in one place was great, but the way I experienced it in a different place was even more incredible. So, a great little tool.
Okay. Have you seen these types of assessments work, and can you give a specific, perhaps?
I was lucky, very fortunate in my career to have served, been selected as a Robert Wood Johnson Executive Nurse Fellow. And in that experience, it is full of self-assessments. They would bring in individuals, and we did everything from from Voices to Myers-Briggs, you name it. And not only was it filling out the tool and interpreting the results, which some tools that are valid and reliable come with extreme resources of all sorts of things that you need to further study, further reflection. But in that room, there was an expectation that as you learned about yourself, you use the other people in your group to validate progress and learning, so that everybody became aware of things that people were selecting to work on, and then we all had an obligation to help one another be very aware of that. And for us in that organization and that group we belong to, it not only came from the people in your class, we called it a cohort, but from the advisory committee that oversaw the program to the people who were really running the program day to day. So you were surrounded all the time by people giving you feedback on everything from how you walked, spoke, how you answered questions. So for me, what that taught me was self-assessment is one thing. You can fill out a tool or read a book and you may get some tidbits. But it's in the interaction with others, which is really the essence of leadership, is how will you portray yourself to others is what is most important. And I think that's probably one of the most valuable lessons I've learned. It's one thing to read about it. It's another thing to practice it and hone that craft.
So what if you have someone that works for you, okay, a leader in another part of the organization, but they're under your umbrella, and you know that they have a blind spot, as you called it, or they have a hard time seeing themselves objectively? How could a self-assessment be helpful, and how would you use that if you're a senior executive that wants to help, wants to coach them, wants to give them some ideas? How would you use that?
Well, the first thing I would say is before you can even, begin that process, you have to have a relationship with that particular person or the people that you're going to be working with that is true and trustful and transparent enough, or whatever the current lingo is, that what you're offering that person is perceived as helpful. You've got to make sure you've got that
again, that first level,
therapeutic relationship to begin with, right? And I think that's oftentimes not there, and that's a big mistake people make, is they think they have that relationship with somebody, but that other person doesn't feel it going both ways, and so help that you're offering is perceived in a way other than you're sending it. Yeah. So the first thing to do, I think, is to make sure that you've got solid relationships with the people you're working with and expected to be mentoring, and those conversations need to be happening way before you get to a point where you're really getting into some diagnostic stuff and you're trying to really get at what that blind spot is. So working on that relationship to begin with is what's important, and those are a matter of style and time together and things you've done before, but that will not go well unless you've got that groundwork laid. So assuming you have that groundwork laid, I think that it's in the spirit of building. It's in the spirit of trying to encourage people and enable people to grow into sometimes what they can't even see themselves. I mean, I think the people I've helped the most are the people that I can see it. I can see it before they can, and I can almost put my finger on it and say, here's what I just need to pull that thread, and they have no idea that they even have that. And so I think that's a great gift that a great mentor can give to a person that hasn't even discovered themselves as a leader yet. Sure. And so I've had that great opportunity, many, many times in my career, and there's some of the most fun things you do is bring somebody along that you saw it way before they did, and when you have that kind of relationship and people perceive that you're trying to help them and that you have their best interest in mind, I have had great success at having them use these kind of tools, all different kinds of things. Now, what they do with it, I mean, I think that's part of your question. Yeah. What if you give them the tool and they get this great feedback and they just cannot get there? You know what I mean? They just can't
don't know what to do, how to start. Yeah.
I think that again, with whatever style you have, but basically to say this really is a very effective tool. The fact that you don't think it's working for you, that's where we should start talking. The fact that you think you're the only person that this tool is not accurate for is probably the place we should start working on, because that's probably not the case.
Yeah.
So there's something about what's in this that's really a struggle for you. And I can see it, but you can't. So how do we get there?
Yeah.
And then you tap into what are you going to do about it? But you can't let them run away from it. That's the main thing. It's just like anything else, setting the expectation and then working together to get there.
Jerry, have you seen these kind of tools used effectively, whether it's this one or others you've used, and really helpful, powerful, valuable for other people that have, let's say, worked for you?
I would say that the 360-degree evaluations have been the most important, but how it's done is as important as completing the activity itself.
Right.
So recently had a team in my management career that completed these 360s, and as we're going through it, the person that reports to me is not required to share with me specific information. That's part of the gift of the process, because as you mentioned, you have people that this individual reports to fill it out, this person's peer group that they select, plus individuals that report to this individual. And what I found interesting is there was an individual who was given some feedback from the people they reported to, and her comment is that she could tell who wrote them. And I said, well, that's interesting. So let's talk about how many people did you select? Well, there were 2. I happened to be one of them. And then there was another individual. And so she said, I knew exactly what you said based on how you said it. And I said, well, you'll have to show me it because I can't remember exactly what I said. But I think my feedback was true. But I knew this individual had interactions with other leaders and chose not to include them in the evaluation. And so we began to talk about that.
Right.
My comment to them was, why didn't you include this individual, and this individual? They seemed surprised by that. Right. I said, well, those people are important to your career. You have a reporting relationship with them in a matrix fashion in this organization. So the fact that you left them out, and I know they have feedback for you, this could have been very helpful.
So I think that's the beauty of the tool, is that the diagnostic tool isn't necessarily in what appears on the paper. That's what I think. That's what we're both saying. It's the context in which the report falls that you say, isn't that interesting? That you got this answer and they don't match up, or you got this answer and it's not what you thought you would get, or you got this answer and you only asked your 3 friends, and what's that about? So I think the tools are great, but the context in which you do something with them is what really matters. And that's a great example of, there's more to this report than just, I don't like what it says, right?
And who said it?
And I'd like to just emphasize, when we talk about these tools, there are some that are validated and reliable, and a lot of people use them, which goes to, I should find this applicable to me in spite of how unique I think I am.
Yeah.
However, there are tools that people have that they can access in books and articles that before you put a lot of stock in that, you really should research, where does this come from? Is this somebody's just opinion? Because if you're going to invest time in self-development and self-awareness, you want to make sure you're putting your time and energy that's going to be the most fruitful.
Sure.
And an evidence-based tool.
I was exactly thinking just that. It has to be research-based.
Like that. Thank you, Jerry.
You're welcome.
Nice segue. But I want to kind of tease out one thing you said earlier, Jerry, and that was, for you tend to go, what is my lowest score? And it's not just you, by the way. Many, many leaders that I've worked with and coached over the years, I don't know if it's human nature, it's the school system that sets us up for, let's find out where we are terrible and work on it and try to get a better grade. But I see it a lot. And so you're not alone, and we probably all do it at some point. But I like to have us focus on our strengths, too. Where are you strong? And how have you seen that, both for yourself and for others in your organization, this focusing on your strengths? How does that help you become a more effective leader of a team, of an organization?
I think there's something that if a strength is identified by a group of individuals, or it's a repetitive thing you've heard over your career, then that's really something to exploit in your current role, because there's something about that could be very valuable to the organization. But I also think that in exploiting that, you have an obligation as a leader to ensure that others gain some information about how that's effective for you. So if I just have that as my thing that I'm good at, and I only do it for myself, and I use it for sort of self-advancement, that's really not helping the group. But if there is someone who's struggling with that, you could offer to say, you seem to have a hard time getting up in front of a group of people talking. You have a great personality one-on-one, but to be an effective leader, how do you deliver a message? Why don't we find you a group or a committee or a project or something where you can take point? I can stand in the back, help you out, encourage you, give you feedback, but let's use this as a growth opportunity for you.
I call that offering the comfortable stretch. You know, like it's within a comfortable region, but it still requires a little bit of a stretch. And I'm going to be there for you, but like I need you to stretch, you know, and but not throwing them into like some extreme other circumstance where, you know, there's no chance of success. Right. So those sort of incremental successes,
right,
where you're moving them along with you standing by.
So I think that's an obligation we have, is if you're really good at something, you help others develop that which you seem to find easier to do, or something you're good at. And I would want the same for me. When people see me struggling with something that I may not be aware of or need some help on, that someone would reach out to me and help me with something I could improve.
Now, I happen to be in the wonderful position of having evaluated both of your assessments that you took and gave you the score, and we talked about it a little bit. And you were both strong. You rated yourself highly, as did your people rated you highly, in encouraging the heart. Okay. To me, that's kind of gets at a lot of the heart of focusing on people's strengths, where they're good, how you encourage them, enable them, empower them to be even more than, as you said, even more than they think they are. So how has that benefited you in your career to be good at this thing called encouraging the heart, to be very, giving out praise where it's warranted and freely, and giving and catching people in the act of doing things right, those kinds of things? How do you use that to benefit the whole of the organization?
I think it's one of the most powerful things as a leader you can do. And I think it's remarkable to me how hard some people find it to do. I'm always amazed at how hard I see people struggling to just acknowledge things that other people are doing. It's always, because I've always found it pretty easy to do. If something gets done, again, maybe this is my team orientation, sort of like if we win the game, I thank the first baseman, the second baseman, because we couldn't have done it unless everybody did their part. So that's just sort of my natural orientation. But it's a remarkable thing to see how hard it is for people to just take a minute, and say to somebody eye to eye, connected in a way that says, I really, really appreciate what you did for us today, because we could have never, this whole thing we just rolled out or whatever could never have happened if you hadn't done such a great job with your part. Those kind of things just go so deep. And they're the right thing to do to begin with, but they buy you so much, future opportunity with this person. So, but that has to happen consistently and from the heart. You cannot fake that.
No.
If you fake that, you're finished. And so if you go over to somebody and say, thank you very much, I really appreciate it, and people know you're not really meaning it, like that's worse than saying nothing. So I just think it kind of speaks to that natural style that people have too. Like, what's your natural style that you bring to your leadership role? What kind of just person are you? How do you function? Who are you? And what do you bring? And if that's something that you don't bring, that is something that you need to work on. But people who don't acknowledge other people, I think that it's a very, very fundamental flaw that will preclude you from really getting where you want to go, because you can't lead all by yourself.
Yeah.
Ever. You can't do it by yourself. It's not a single person job. And so if you can't figure out how to get other people leading alongside you, I think you're finished.
Yeah. So. How has Encourage the Heart helped you and your organizations?
I've done the same thing that Lynn has, and I read on the topic quite a bit. And most people would know I'm a pretty compassionate, emotional person. That's one of the flaws I'm working on, is I tend to go a little bit too far, because I can really feel when someone is struggling or having a hard time. I get very emotionally connected to that right away. And sometimes as a leader, it's good to stay connected, but you can't let it skew what you need to do in terms of an objective response to something that may or may not have happened. But for me, I try to be very purposeful in my interactions with people, particularly when something has gone well. And so I will ask my leadership team to really set me up to have a meaningful interaction with somebody who's done something right. Mm-hmm. So I'll ask people, when's the next time this person's scheduled? What time is a good time for me to show up? And what do they need to hear?
And what do they value?
Yeah, what's
recognition.
important to them?
Right.
Is it a pat on the back? Is it a cup of coffee? And it sounds like we're being very trite in that, but I have been shocked about really how little you really need to do just to recognize somebody for doing the right thing. But if you can tag it to something they actually did versus thanks for all you do, if you can identify what it was, it comes back to you. These people remember you. And it's really, I think it encourages everyone. It sends a message to the employee that hears it. It lets the director who reports to you or the manager that this is important, maybe I should start doing it. It sort of sets the example on what should be done. And why? Because we like to get it ourselves. So if it's important for us and we want to hear it, why shouldn't we be doing it more often for others?
I think the other piece of that, and that I would just mention, is some people like public recognition and some people like private recognition. And if you mix them up and you haven't done sort of your due diligence to talk to people that know that person, that can really backfire, because some people like you to step out in the middle of the unit and say, "Mary, come on over. I want to tell everybody about this great thing you did." And so for some people that's great, but if it's not Mary's thing, that will be a non-gratifying thing. So
there's also a backfire. If you are recognizing an individual for something that they've done, but the rest of the team doesn't feel that person the way you do, based on what the little bit of information you have, it could have a negative reinforcing effect.
Right.
So that overall, a person may be getting recognized for something, and the team looks at you with sort of eyes aghast of, how could you possibly be?
Yeah, there's things you don't know that we
The
know.
event happened, but let me tell you what it's like to work with him or her 24 hours a day. So I've actually had that happen to me once before, and it was nonverbals in a staff meeting that clued me in that,
there's more to this than I see.
My perception of how I believe this person is not how the team feels. So I need to check this out.
It doesn't mean you don't reward and recognize. It just means you got to be aware of these kinds of things.
Right, and do your homework, and again, there's a lot to be said for context.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say somewhere mixed in here was the natural leadership style that people have. You know, you're a natural, team leader, transformational leader, but that you can't just have one style. I'm sure everybody knows this, but how do you seamlessly switch gears so it doesn't seem to people like, well, this is a crisis, so I'm going to switch now into this other thing because that's what the moment calls for. So you do have to be sensitive to some of what we talked about earlier, like what's your natural style, but also how do I develop the styles I'm not so comfortable with, so that when we are, because I think of when I worked in New Jersey along the shore, and when a hurricane was coming, sort of have a meeting, get everybody's opinion, and have this discussion, and we'll make a plan. That doesn't work because the hurricane is coming, and we need, some very sort of autocratic decision making. And when people know you in your natural style and know that that's, you're doing this for a reason, they'll go right with you because that's the leadership they want when the hurricane's coming. Right. But you have to, build those skills, because sometimes that's very uncomfortable for somebody who likes to feel like everybody's, had a voice in things. So
this last question feels like sort of okay, now what do I do? I've got some self-awareness. I've got feedback, whether it's through an instrument like this or some other way, that you've got some really good feedback that you believe. So what do you do with it? And what's the next steps with that? What advice do you have for leaders who get feedback like this and want to do something? What should they do? What are the next steps? Do they come up with an action plan? Do they share it with others? I mean, what have you seen works best?
Well, some people are good with written action plans. I think writing things down or writing a particular goal down is very important, because when you write it down, chances are you're more likely to achieve it. There's good literature to support that. And then there's also those people who are checklist aversive. I'm not, once it's written in check, I'm already oh. So I think you need to do something. Again, what is the thing that you do that, in your own style, in your own way, that you're sure you're doing something? How are you going to know you're working on that and you're getting that feedback? So for me, it's it's becoming aware of it, and then usually working with a colleague that I can say, here's what I want to be working on. And it's somebody that I have regular contact with, or a couple people, peers, 360 again, if you can. People all around you that you then say, this is what I'm working on. This is a real stretch for me. And so can you just give me feedback on that? Because
and I would say work on it over time. Let's say 5-6 months.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
And ask them again.
So by the summer, I'd really like
better?
to see some, I'd like to be feeling like I'm getting somewhere with this. So I want the feedback on a regular basis. Like if we're at a meeting and I say to you, I want to be doing more of this, and you see me doing more of what I've always done, could you please tell me that? And so that's the best way for me, because I hear it better that way. Because again, I'm still moving on, and so it's not my natural style to go check my checklist and see how did I work on that today. It's not. I just don't ever do that. But in the moment, in a relationship-based kind of thing, that's what I want to hear. I hear it better than I read it, I guess, and that's what I've done historically, and that has been very, very effective, because they're people I trust, and they're people that I know will tell me. Because you can run into that other thing, you ask people to tell you stuff and they're afraid to, because of some dynamic that's going on. So these have got to be people that care about you and want to help you develop. How do you make it real, Jerry, once you've got some good information that you believe?
Two things. She alluded to it. One of them is developing a sort of a personal advisory group. It's not a formal thing. You don't have to have agendas and minutes and meetings, but if there are several individuals in the organization that you trust and that can give you unfiltered feedback about how you're doing and what they're hearing, that can be extremely valuable. Just be open to what they're saying, because if you start to argue or disagree with the feedback you're getting, you won't get the feedback you need. That's that vulnerability thing that you and I have talked about, being willing to hear it. And the second thing I found is that for me, it's sort of journaling about it, because as I write it, it sort of helps me sort of cull it down into something that's more actionable versus just I'm feeling this for pages. Well, what am I going to do about it? Once I identify what that is, I've asked individuals in the organization, here's something I'm working on, who in this place or who do you know does this really well? And then once I get that name, I may meet with them. I may spend more time watching objectively what they're doing and how they do it. There have been times when I've shared a private email about, hey, you've been identified as somebody in this organization that does this well. This is something I'm struggling with. Do you have any tips or thoughts or ideas? And you'd be surprised how willing people are to come out and help you work through things. And then it's a win-win. You've established a relationship with somebody new. You've expressed a little vulnerability that says, I'm not perfect. But then when you see some progress and then validate back 5-6 months later that something's changed, you're better at this before. I mean, thank you for helping me. Then you're telling the person, I couldn't have done this without you. Thanks for letting me know my fault. I think that is a very reinforcing message to a leader that if they provide you feedback, you'll do something with it. And something that, again, because we've had several conversations about this that I want to give you credit for, that I learned from talking to you about this, was the idea of that same idea, but outside your organization. So in your professional networking, because you had some great ideas relative to that in one other conversation we had about sometimes, the best advice doesn't come from the place you're in, because everybody's in it with you and you're all working on the same stuff. And as you develop those, your Robert Wood Johnson cohort or your professional colleagues in whatever it might be, that you can then have other places to go outside of your small world to get some of that feedback, it's a different kind of feedback and a different kind of coaching, but it can't all come from one place. You've got to have different ways of growing, using. So I just didn't want to steal your idea. I just wanted to give you credit. I learned that from you. That's something I don't think a lot of people even think about is, people you've been on a committee with through the AONE. You met somebody and she's in, California, but you had great rapport on that committee. That's a great person to reach out to and say, I just want to run this thing by you because I'm really struggling with it. So make sure your world is big, as big as you can make it, so that you get advice from as many places as possible. Because otherwise, you run the risk of kind of hearing what you are expecting to hear.
Yeah.
And that sort of then reinforces that, hey, I've got this figured out, when you might be missing some very important information that you ought to clue yourself into.
It's a big world.
Yeah, it really is. And you both shared so much valuable information here based on your experiences, which we really appreciate. I'm going to ask you to leave us with the shiniest of golden nuggets on this whole notion of self-awareness and how important it is for leaders. In a 20-second little ending. I know, 20 seconds, it's tough. Or, something short, just golden nugget.
Well, I think for me, it's a journey. And I think that for me, I've never been sort of the typical leader type. And I think that's good. I think that the more variety, sort of the more varied the fruit stand, that different people bring different things. And so take your special, gifts and talents and start there. But always know that, it's a journey. And if you keep doing things the way you've always done them, you'll get the same results. And if you want to grow and you want to progress and you want more and you want things to be more interesting, because I get bored very easily. So to keep it interesting, I have always been a moving it forward kind of person. But you've got to keep it moving. Yeah. It's not something you arrive at and say, man, I am a great leader. Because once you've decided on that, you're finished. Okay. Have I said that already? There's 3 different ways I said you're finished. But it's a long road. Yeah. But you got to keep it interesting. Yeah. And the way to keep it interesting is to keep yourself interesting, I think.
And try to make it fun.
Oh,
I know that's
that's why I'm not your typical leader.
Word,
I think because
it's got to fit. But try to make life somewhat fun.
Yeah.
Jerry, a closing thought?
Well, I think your message about it's a journey is absolutely true. And again, I keep using the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation experience as the example, but it is striking. I mean, when you interact with people who at their time in life and their experiences ought to have been what you would consider leadership. Marilyn Withrow, former U.S. Treasurer. Shirley Chater, Commissioner for Social Security Administration under Clinton. Frances Hesselbein, the CEO President of the Girl Scouts of America. When these people you meet talk about their leadership journey and that they are learning from you in an interaction, that is an aha moment to say, if those people who have achieved so much in their lifetime believe they are still growing, why shouldn't you? So that should open you up to the idea that you haven't arrived, you have a lot to work on, but if you do it in context of a community, you can learn a lot about yourself and maybe, in fact, influence others.
And always be open. Some of the most important messages I've gotten about what I'm doing have not come from my colleagues. They've come from very interesting places across an organization. Little voices, that are out there that if you don't stop and pay attention, you'll miss it. And if you miss it, you may never hear it again. But those little whispers from out there are, I think, some of the most profound, sounds you can hear in your career.
Yeah.
You got to be open.
That's right. So thank you both very much for sharing your wisdom on this very important topic. I have a question for the audience now. I'll not know if you answered correctly or not, so I hope you do. I started with some research done by the Center for Creative Leadership that said the difference maker, the big difference maker between successful leaders and those that derail is what? Pause for you to answer. Yes, you got it right. Self-awareness. So whatever you can do to become more self-aware, first you have to understand yourself before you can even begin to think about how you can impact and have an influence, a positive influence, hopefully, on other people in your team and your organization. So please read more about this topic, think more about it, think what can you do, what 1 or 2 things can you start doing today to increase your level of self-awareness and happy leading. Thank you.